Let me now introduce Dr. Michael Stamm, who is going to talk about trade, empire, and the peril of annexation, the debate about reciprocity in North America. And with that, I will be brief, and it's all yours.
The title's actually changed slightly, but it is the same topic, more or less. This is based on a book that I'm in the process of finishing. The initial research was funded through a generous grant by the Consul General's office, and Dennis Moore was very generous in helping that along at the beginning. So let's see, where do I start from? Okay, so this is a paper about paper. It's about the paper crossing the US-Canada border. It's first as blank sheets going south, then printed newspapers going north. It's about the life cycle of a printed text. It starts with a tree in the Canadian forest. It follows it as it's industrially manufactured into newsprint, and then as it goes to the US to be printed, to have content printed on it, and then made into a newspaper. And finally, some of this paper is then sent back to Canada, where the words printed on it become the subject of concern and debate for what they say about Canada's place in the world. So in following the newspapers in international industrial production in North America and tracing the flow of this paper across the border, I think we can see a lot of things about emerging debates about forestry, trade, and empire and culture across the US-Canada border. So the figure at the heart of this story is an American named Robert McCormick. He was the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, one of the most notorious conservatives in the US in the first half of the 20th century. Like the Fox News and Murdoch organizations today, the Tribune was widely understood to be a partisan outlet dominated by a very conservative leader, and it was rightly perceived to be not only conservative on its editorial page, but to slant its news accordingly in the news. It was the Tribune, McCormick's Tribune, after all, that boldly, wishfully, and incorrectly announced that the Republican Thomas Dewey had defeated the Democrat Harry Truman in the 1948 presidential election. One could see demonstrations of McCormick's patriotism, his nationalism, and his chauvinism on the Tribune's masthead, which framed its news. You see, it's an American paper for Americans on the left side under the American flag, and then the world's greatest newspaper. It was not a paper known for its cosmopolitanism or its modesty. But besides being politically conservative, McCormick was also one of America's most prominent isolationists. And from the time he took over the Tribune in 1911 until he died in 1955, this is a period that spanned both world wars, his published views and public statements gave him a well-deserved reputation as one of the most prominent anti-British figures in North America. And so what I'd like to focus on here is the relationship between this conservative and anti-British publisher and the conditions of this newspaper's industrial production. McCormick owned a company that was on the one hand a generator of media content, but he also operated a manufacturing firm that operated across the US-Canada border in order to manufacture the Chicago Tribune. So McCormick had taken over the Tribune in 1911. His family had owned it since the 1850s. It was a moderately successful morning paper when he took it over. About 180,000 papers a day. By 1918, circulation was 400,000. By 1941, it was over 1 million. By the time of his death in 1955, he built it into the second highest circulating paper in the country. The only paper with a higher circulation was a paper that he owned in New York, the New York Daily News, which he started in 1919, and which his eccentric cousin Joe Patterson ran there. He came to have a tremendous influence over the politics of Chicago and New York, but also over the continent. And he developed this media organization through an aggressive process of vertical integration. Some of this went into the new media of the day. He was a pioneer in radio, the WGN, the radio, television, and satellite station. The acronym the call letter stood for World's Greatest Newspaper, and he started the station in 1924. But he was also really innovative in manufacturing a newspaper. Now, newspapers are strange commodities. They're industrially manufactured goods. You make hundreds of thousands of this good on Tuesday, then you make hundreds of thousands of a different one on Wednesday, and you do this every single day through a diversified labor force. What many people tend to focus on when they talk about newspapers is the people at the upper floors of the diagram, which are the people in the editorial rooms and the content. What I'd like to focus on is the stuff at the bottom, and it's this plant here, especially these roles of newsprint. Newsprint is sort of like 19th century bandwidth. If you don't have the paper, you don't get to reach the public. Making this paper was the most important part of making a newspaper in the early 20th century. It was the most expensive line item in making a newspaper. So this is the Tribune's, if you start then, there's the paper there. Working backwards, there's the wood pile of what we now call the dead trees. And this is the sort of manufacturing process that you can trace back to the forest. It's then loaded onto boats, and then it's taken down to the U.S. And what's left out of this diagram is the fact that on that ship then is going to cross an international border. And so I want to talk about that. So these are the dead trees, as we now call them, that are at the start of the Tribune's the Tribune's life cycle. And it's sort of this idea that we call newspapers, we call them dead tree media. And this is a term that's been, it's become so common, it entered the Oxford English Dictionary in 2007. And it's usually meant to give this impression that newspapers are these lifeless remnants sticking around and cluttering up this era in which these devices are much more vibrant and participatory. But there's a literal truth. They really were dead trees, and this is where they started. This is the beginning. This is the spring log drive on the North Shore in Quebec, and this is where these are the dead trees that the Tribune used to make their papers. A century ago, that's all they were the products of dead trees. You couldn't make a newspaper without tons, literally tons of newspapers. And in making these newspapers, the Tribune came to have a significant effect on the environment and the policies and the politics of North America. Many of the most plentiful trees to make newsprint were not available to the publishers that were clustered along the Great Lakes in the Northeast in the early 20th century, where all the populations were and all the circulation was. The Douglas fir of the West Coast and the pine of the American South was not well suited to make newsprint. Pine had too much pitch, you had to bleach it, and it took a lot to get the pine from the south to the north. Spruce is ideal because you can make a good sheet of newsprint without a ton of chemical processing, and it's all right along the Great Lakes, and it's all right along the Atlantic Ocean, so transportation costs are lower. The problem for Americans is that all of this spruce is in Canada, and all of the circulation is in the United States. And so both American publishers and Canadian government officials want to how do we get these trees down to the US where the publishers want them? So one of the ways that they tried to do this was these sort of mostly forgotten debates about reciprocity, essentially free trade in 1911. They began debating, the two representatives of the two countries began debating free trade in 1911 about this. It was mostly agricultural products. It was mostly wheat and fruit. The significant manufactured good that went on the free list was finished newsprint. That was the one significant manufacturing good that went on to the list of things that would be given for the free trade status in the pact. It was to be implemented by concurrent legislation, so the US Congress then approved the pact enthusiastically. When it went to Canada for approval, it proved much more divisive, and they eventually had to dissolve Parliament. They called an election, and the anti-reciprocity Conservatives defeated the Laurier Liberals. This was the end of Laurier's time as Prime Minister in Canada in 1911. And when the election was over, it was not Borden defeats Laurier, it was reciprocity is repudiated. It was essentially a single issue election in Canada in 1911 that ended Laurier's time as the Prime Minister. Reciprocity failed in Canada for a variety of reasons, one of the most significant of which was the fear of annexation by the United States. It's not as irrational a fear as it seems today. The US in 1911 was in the midst of an imperial moment. We had just won the Spanish-American War. We had taken control of the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. We had motivated the creation of the new nation of Panama because we wanted a canal through it. And many Canadians began to fear that their country might just be next. There are people in Congress that spoke with an unnerving frankness about this to Canadians. In February of 1911, one of them, a man named Champ Clark, a Democrat from Missouri, who would not long after making these remarks become the Speaker of the House of Representatives, remarked, and this is the quote there, he says, "I hope to see the day when the American flag will float over every square foot of British North American possessions clear to the North Pole. They are people of our blood. They speak our language. Their institutions are much like ours. They are trained in the difficult art of self-government." So these were extreme views, and for many Americans, the trade pact simply was a way to get the raw materials that they wanted. But for Canadians who heard these things, these public proclamations about annexation raised deep concerns about the country's relationship to the United States. The debate about a trade pact for many Canadians was a threat to the integrity of the national border and indeed the nation. And for many Canadians, they understood American newspaper publishers to be behind some of this. And to them, it was no accident that newsprint was the significant manufactured good on the free list. And so this is a comic that was published just before the election. We see President William Howard Taft there leading a parade followed by William Fielding. He was the Liberal Minister of Finance who had negotiated the treaty for the Canadians. The paid reciprocity press following along Hearst's yellow fanfare beating the drum, and in the rear there's a man holding up a sign blaming the Americans. The sign reads, "Canadians must vote for reciprocity as I tell them, or it will be worse for them." And that's the paid reciprocity press at the end. So rejecting reciprocity meant not only rejecting what they saw as, for Canadians, not only what they saw as economic imperialism, but to some degree rejecting an American media and cultural imperialism. So I'll come back to this map a little bit here. Reciprocity didn't, the defeat of reciprocity didn't deter American publishers, and the negotiations continued between the Americans and the Canadians. And they succeeded in 1913 as part of the passage of the Underwood Tariff. Newsprint was given duty-free status in North America. So there was an integrated continental economy in newsprint starting in 1913. In effect, so the newspapers, for the most important input to their business, they have free trade for it. Now, the key part of this is that the Canadian policymakers specifically said you can't have the logs. They wanted American capital. They wanted what we would later call branch plants. They wanted foreign investment, and they wanted the Americans to build newsprint factories and they said you can take the newsprint, but you can't take the trees. They wanted the capital investment and the skilled labor to do this. And this was the international supply chain that the Tribune set up. So you see Chicago at the left side of this, and then you see they have the New York Daily News down there, and this is the supply chain. It's very difficult to find the international border on the map. This is a map that the Tribune did. It essentially doesn't really, you really have to look on the map to find where the border is. So almost immediately after the passage of the Underwood Tariff, the Tribune Company takes advantage of this free trade in newsprint, and they build a mill on the Welland Canal at Thorold, Ontario. There's cheap power available from Niagara Falls, and once you get it on the Welland, it's easy to get the paper to Chicago. And so it allowed them a great degree of ability to rationalize their production, control their costs. But when they started the New York Daily News, they realized that they needed a lot more paper. The Daily News took off in its circulation. It needed a lot of paper. And so the Tribune began trying to figure out ways of getting more trees to put into their mills. And so they eventually got a series of really large land concessions across Canada. So they had a couple pieces at Little Pick and Heron Bay on the north shore of Lake Superior. And probably more importantly, they ended up with some stuff on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River. They had about 6,500 square miles of timberlands upon which they had the exclusive privilege to cut trees. It's bigger than the American state of Connecticut. They don't own it. It's an exclusive lease given by the province. And so their newsprint needs were massive by this point. By 1940, they estimated they were using about 1/10 of all of the newsprint in the United States to print their 2 newspapers. And so they realized, we probably should have more than just the mill down in, there's Thorold right there. They should have more than that mill. They should build a mill to supply the Daily News because they can put it right up near their timber leases because they can put it right on the Atlantic and take it down by boat. And so what they decided to do in 1937 was to build a town that took the name of Baie-Comeau. So they started building the town in 1937. It opened in 1938 to great fanfare in the press. Quebec newspaper remarking in June of 1938 that from, quote, from a bay around which there was just a year and a half ago desert and desolation to now a small beautiful city with a huge paper mill, it seemed that a fairy had waved his magic wand. And the future Prime Minister Brian Mulroney would then be born in March of the following year. His father Benedict had moved to Baie-Comeau to take a job in the mill when it was being constructed. And Mulroney talks glowingly about McCormick and the Tribune in his autobiography, and he would often use his background to stump for the FTA in the 1980s. So by the mid-1930s, what you essentially have is a U.S. newspaper operating as a multinational manufacturing firm. There's essentially no border for the Chicago Tribune as a media corporation, taking its trees from Canada down to the U.S. And to make itself into, to print what were explicitly right-wing newspapers. So the war changed things, changed a lot of things. It changed a lot of things about the Tribune's operations in Canada. And for Canadians, the content of the Tribune came to seem, the Tribune came to be seen as threatening and objectionable on its politics and its culture. And the Tribune's isolationism and its stance towards Canada and towards Britain was something that Canadians had long known about. Even before Germany invaded Poland on September the 1st, 1939, the Tribune and the Daily News make up perhaps what is perhaps the most effective isolationist bloc in the daily press, as one Canadian journalist noted. So Britain declared war on Germany on September the 3rd, 1939. Canada followed on September the 10th. The US would not be in the war until the end of 1941, and then only when we were attacked by the Japanese. So the Tribune, there's more than a 2-year gap in which the Tribune's isolationist stance really becomes to rankle Canadians, and it makes many come to question the morality of the porousness of this border. Was it worthwhile to allow this paper to come down, to go from Canada to the US, to print stuff that was against the British and the Canadian war effort, which is exactly what McCormick was doing with his newspaper. This line of thinking picks up momentum into 1940. In May, the Ottawa Journal claimed that, quote, for sheer malice against the British Empire and the Allied cause, and for absolute misrepresentation of Allied aims, the Tribune was surpassed only by the propaganda of Herr Goebbels. The Canadians knew. The Journal pointed out that the paper's manufacturing department was located in Canada, and it was outraged that, quote, Canadian forests and Canadian water power were being used by a bitter, sinister enemy. And it claimed that the paper should be, quote, barred from this country if not dealt with more dramatically. And you find editorials like this throughout Canada. The Lindsay Post, another paper in Ontario, said that the Tribune gives its readers a daily dose of trash in its pages, and it goes against the grain to have Canadian forest products manufactured into paper, which is destined to circulate in anti-British journals in the Republic to the south. And you find these things even in Quebec, where the support for the war was not as strong. The Anglophone Montreal Star claimed that Robert McCormick was a Benedict Arnold in the shade, and even the Francophone paper, L'Illustration Nouvelle, criticized the Tribune's isolationist articles, remarking that it was, quote, remarkable that these articles are printed on paper that is the product of our natural resources. These accusations filtered into the Canadian Parliament. A Saskatchewan MP named T.L. Church called for a bill to restrict the Nazi gutter press of the United States. He named only the Chicago Tribune and the Saturday Evening Post as these offenders. In the Senate, P.E. Blondin and Arthur Meehan took up the attack on the allegedly subversive Chicago Tribune. Meehan called it a nauseating mixture of ignorance and malignancy from the first line to the last, and said that it will do more harm among the ignorant people than anything else I know published on the continent. These diatribes against the Tribune struck a chord with many ordinary Canadians, and many of them wrote letters to the government and tried to form grassroots movements against the Tribune. And there was one fellow named J.H. Sherrard. He wrote an open letter to the Montreal Star that he also had duplicated and widely distributed across Canada. He blasted the Tribune for its anti-British attitudes, and in his circular said, "Are we supposed to conserve our forests in order to assure the Chicago Tribune of ample newsprint wherewith to assail us further? And after all," he concluded, "these people are not our friends." So to conclude, though they consider it, Canadian public officials ultimately declined to censor or ban the Tribune. And the issue changed after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the Tribune did come around to supporting the Allied cause in the war effort. But McCormick remained a resolutely nationalist American during the war, and he added to this an ardent anti-communism. After the war, his anti-British views returned to the paper in a very prominent way after the war, something that was regularly noted about him in profiles of him down to his death in 1955. McCormick is not that well remembered by many Americans today, and the role that his newspaper played in Canada is similarly not that well remembered by Canadians under the age of 80. If you ask Canadians, as I have, over the age of 80, they very much know, they have very strong opinions about Robert McCormick, most of them not favorable. But the criticisms the criticisms that were raised in the Canadian press by public officials and by ordinary people, there's two interesting variants of anxieties that they represent, I think. On the one hand, they're anxieties about American cultural influence through the mass media. There's a concern that this American outlet is going to have this outsized influence on Canadian politics and on Canadian culture, and you can trace certain aspects of this anxiety down to debates about how much Canadian content gets broadcast. But people knew that this was not just about media content. It was about trade, and it was about empire. Canadians understood that industrial newspapers like the Tribune were taking staple products. It was forest products for much of the 20th century. It's oil from Alberta today. But the anxieties were the same. There is this idea that there is this resource chomping hegemon to the south, which is taking something from Canada that it wants, and it creates a power imbalance that some would call imperial. So, thank you very much.